9-year-old Hannah Whitmore vanished without a trace on a September morning in 2004, leaving behind only a bouquet of violets on her grandmother's grave. The small farming town of Willow Creek had never experienced anything like it. Children didn't simply disappear in broad daylight from a cemetery where their families had mourned for generations. Hannah had been different from other children her age. While her classmates played with dolls and video games, she preferred reading poetry and tending to her mother's garden. She spoke with a maturity that sometimes unsettled adults, as if she carried ancient wisdom in her young soul. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, often remarked that Hannah seemed to understand things about life and death that most children her age couldn't grasp. On that fateful morning, Hannah had woken before dawn. Her mother, Elaine, found her sitting by the kitchen window, already dressed in her best Sunday dress, a pale blue one with tiny white flowers that her grandmother had sewn for her just months before her death. Hannah clutched a small bouquet of violets she had picked from their garden, the same flowers her grandmother had loved most. "I dreamed about Grandma Rose again," Hannah had whispered to her mother, her green eyes distant and thoughtful. She was standing by her grave, waiting for someone. "I think she was waiting for me." Elaine Whitmore had always been protective of her only daughter, but something about Hannah's request to visit the cemetery alone that morning felt different. Perhaps it was the way Hannah spoke with such certainty, or maybe it was the strange peace that seemed to settle over her young daughter's features. Against her better judgment, Elaine agreed, watching from the porch as Hannah walked down the gravel path toward Rose Hill Cemetery, her small figure disappearing into the morning mist. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by dense oak and pine forests that had stood for over a century. It was a place where 5 generations of Willow Creek families had been laid to rest, where the town's history was etched in weathered stone and overgrown with ivy. Hannah's grandmother, Rose Eleanor Whitmore, had been buried there just 2 years earlier. In a plot near the cemetery's eastern wall, Detective Marcus Rivera had been with the Willow Creek Police Department for only 3 years when Hannah disappeared. He was young, ambitious, and determined to prove himself in a town where serious crimes were rare. When the call came in that afternoon about a missing child, he responded immediately, not knowing that this case would haunt him for the next 2 decades. The search began at Rose Hill Cemetery, where Hannah's violets were found carefully arranged on her grandmother's grave. The flowers were fresh, placed with the same care that Hannah had shown every year since her grandmother's death. But there was no sign of the little girl anywhere. Search dogs were brought in from the county, their handlers optimistic about following Hannah's scent. The trail led from her grandmother's grave to the stone wall at the cemetery's edge, where it simply vanished. It was as if Hannah had walked to that spot and disappeared into thin air. Dr. Sarah Chun, the town's only child psychologist, was called in to help with the investigation. She had worked with Hannah before, during the difficult months following her grandmother's death. Hannah had been unusually close to Rose, spending every weekend at her grandmother's house, learning to bake bread and tend to her rose garden. When Rose died suddenly of a heart attack, Hannah had struggled with grief in ways that seemed beyond her years. Hannah was special, Dr. Chun told Detective Rivera during one of their many interviews. She had an unusually strong connection to her grandmother. Sometimes children process grief differently than adults expect. But this disappearance doesn't fit any psychological profile I've seen. The investigation expanded beyond the cemetery. Every house in Willow Creek was searched. Every resident was interviewed. The town's few strangers, a traveling salesman, a construction crew working on the new highway, a group of hunters passing through, were all questioned extensively. But no one had seen Hannah after she left her house that morning. Father Michael O'Brien, the local priest who had conducted Rose Whitmore's funeral, became deeply involved in the search efforts. He organized prayer vigils and coordinated volunteer search parties. But Father O'Brien carried a secret that weighed heavily on his conscience. Just days before her death, Rose Whitmore had come to him with a strange confession. "Father, I've been having dreams," Rose had whispered in the confessional. "Dreams about Hannah. I see her as a grown woman, but she's still 9 years old. She's standing in the cemetery, calling to me. And there's something else, a presence, something dark that wants to take her away from us." Father O'Brien had dismissed it as the ramblings of an elderly woman facing her own mortality. Now, with Hannah missing, those words echoed in his mind. Like a prophecy fulfilled, the Whitmore family home became a shrine to their missing daughter. Elaine refused to change anything in Hannah's room, keeping her bed made, her books arranged exactly as she had left them. Hannah's father, David, threw himself into the search with obsessive determination. He took leave from his job at the local bank and spent every daylight hour combing through the forests surrounding the cemetery. Whitmore was a practical man who dealt in numbers and facts, but Hannah's disappearance pushed him to the edge of his sanity. He hired private investigators, consulted with psychics, and even explored theories about supernatural abductions. His marriage to Elaine began to strain under the weight of their shared grief and his increasingly erratic behavior. "She's out there," David would tell anyone who would listen. "My little girl is out there, and I'm going to find her." And media attention was intense, but brief. News vans filled the quiet streets of Willow Creek for 2 weeks, reporters interviewing neighbors, and broadcasting live from Rose Hill Cemetery. Nancy Chun, an investigative journalist from the state capitol, arrived with her camera crew, determined to uncover the truth behind Hannah's disappearance. Nancy had covered missing children cases before, but something about Hannah's story captivated her. She interviewed everyone connected to the family, from Hannah's teacher to the cemetery groundskeeper, an old man named Thomas Hartley, who had maintained Rose Hill for over 40 years. Thomas Hartley was a man of few words, weathered by decades of working among the dead. He had watched Hannah grow up, seeing her accompany her mother to her grandmother's grave every year. On the morning of Hannah's disappearance, he had been working in the cemetery's western section, too far away to see the girl's arrival. Strange things happen in old cemeteries, Thomas told Nancy during their interview. Places where so many people have been laid to rest. They hold memories, emotions. Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone out there, especially near the older sections. Nancy's investigation uncovered several disturbing facts that the police had overlooked. 3 other children had gone missing from the surrounding counties over the past decade, all of them around Hannah's age, all of them last seen near cemeteries or churches. The cases had never been connected because they occurred in different jurisdictions, but the pattern was undeniable. Detective Rivera was forced to consider the possibility that Hannah's disappearance was part of a larger conspiracy. He reached out to the FBI, requesting help with what might be a serial abduction case. Agent Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in crimes against children, arrived in Willow Creek with a team of federal investigators. Agent Walsh brought new resources and expertise to the investigation. She ordered a comprehensive search of the cemetery, using ground-penetrating radar, looking for any evidence of recently disturbed earth. The results were inconclusive, but they did reveal something unexpected. There were several unmarked graves in the cemetery's oldest section, dating back to the 1800s. The discovery of unmarked graves led to a disturbing piece of local history. Rose Hill Cemetery had been built on the site of an old Native American burial ground, and some of the town's earliest settlers had been buried there without proper records. Local historian Margaret Caldwell was brought in to help identify the unmarked graves. Margaret Caldwell was an elderly woman who had spent her entire life researching Willow Creek's history. She lived in a house filled with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and genealogical records. When she heard about Hannah's disappearance, she immediately began searching through her archives for any similar cases from the town's past. There are stories, Margaret told Agent Walsh during their meeting. Stories that go back generations about children who disappeared from Rose Hill Cemetery. The Native Americans who originally inhabited this land believed that certain places were portals between worlds. They considered this hill sacred, but also dangerous. Margaret's research revealed that at least 6 children had disappeared from or near Rose Hill Cemetery over the past 150 years. The disappearances occurred roughly every 20 to 30 years, always involving children between the ages of 8 and 12. The last documented case before Hannah was in 1979, when a 10-year-old boy named Timothy Ross vanished while playing near the cemetery with friends. Timothy Ross's disappearance had been dismissed as a tragic accident, with most people assuming he had fallen into the creek that ran through the Etched forest behind the cemetery. His body was never found, and his family had moved away from Willow Creek shortly after his disappearance. The pattern Margaret uncovered was chilling, but it was also frustratingly vague. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no clear motive connecting the disappearances across different time periods. The FBI investigation continued for months, but eventually resources were redirected to more recent cases with better leads. By 2006, 2 years after Hannah's disappearance, the active investigation had essentially ended. Detective Rivera was promoted to sergeant, but he never stopped thinking about the case. He kept Hannah's file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, hoping for new evidence or a fresh perspective that might crack the mystery. The town of Willow Creek slowly returned to normal, but the shadow of Hannah's disappearance lingered. Parents became more protective of their children. The cemetery, once a peaceful place of reflection, became associated with fear and loss. Thomas Hartley, the groundskeeper, reported that fewer people visited their loved ones' graves, and those who did rarely stayed long. Elaine Whitmore struggled with severe depression in the years following Hannah's disappearance. She began seeing Dr. Chun regularly, trying to process her grief while maintaining hope that her daughter might return. She developed a routine of visiting Hannah's grandmother's grave every week, bringing fresh violets and sitting quietly among the headstones. "I talked to her," Elaine told Dr. Chun during one of their sessions. "I tell Hannah about my day, about the flowers in the garden, about how much I miss her. Sometimes I feel like she's listening, like she's nearby, but just out of reach." David Whitmore's obsession with finding his daughter eventually cost him his job and nearly his marriage. He spent his savings on private investigators and psychics, following every lead, no matter how far-fetched. When a woman in California claimed to have seen Hannah at a shopping mall, David drove across the country to investigate. The lead proved false, like so many others. The strain on their marriage became unbearable. David began drinking heavily, disappearing for days at a time to search abandoned buildings and remote areas where he thought Hannah might be hidden. Elaine found herself grieving not only for her missing daughter, but for the man her husband had become. "I've lost both of them," Elaine confided to her sister during one of their phone calls. "Hannah is gone, and David is disappearing too, just in a different way." Dr. Chun worked with both parents, helping them navigate their grief while maintaining some semblance of normal life. She recommended support groups for parents of missing children, but the Whitmores found it difficult to connect with others who had experienced similar losses. Their situation felt unique, inexplicable in a way that defied conventional understanding. Father O'Brien continued to pray for Hannah's safe return, but his faith was shaken by the inexplicable nature of her disappearance. He began researching the spiritual history of Rose Hill Cemetery, reading about Native American beliefs and the concept of sacred spaces where the boundary between worlds was thin. "I don't know if I believe in such things," Father O'Brien told. Dr. Chun during one of their conversations. "But I've seen enough in my years as a priest to know that there are forces in this world that we don't fully understand. Maybe Hannah's disappearance is connected to something beyond our physical reality." The years passed slowly in Willow Creek. New families moved to town, children grew up, and life continued its normal rhythm. But for those who remembered Hannah Whitmore, her absence remained a constant reminder of life's fragility and the mysteries that sometimes can't be solved. Detective Rivera, now Chief Rivera, kept Hannah's case file in his office, even after he was promoted to head the department. New officers would sometimes ask about the thick folder marked Whitmore, Hannah, missing person, and Rivera would tell them the story, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something in the original investigation. Had Miss Nancy Chun, the investigative journalist, never forgot about Hannah's case. She wrote a book about missing children in small towns, dedicating a chapter to Hannah's disappearance. The book brought renewed attention to the case, but no new leads emerged. Nancy maintained contact with the Whitmore family, checking in periodically, and keeping Hannah's story in the public eye. Thomas Hartley, the cemetery groundskeeper, retired in 2015 after more than 50 years of maintaining Rose Hill Cemetery. His replacement, a younger man named Jake Morrison, was briefed about the cemetery's history and the mystery surrounding Hannah's disappearance. Jake had heard the stories, but approached his job with a pragmatic attitude, focusing on maintaining the grounds rather than dwelling on past tragedies. Margaret Caldwell, the local historian, continued her research into the cemetery's history until her death in 2018. Before she passed, she donated her entire collection of historical documents to the town library, ensuring that future researchers would have access to the information she had compiled about Rose Hill Cemetery's mysterious past. By 2020, 16 years after Hannah's disappearance, the case had become local legend. Children dared each other to walk through Rose Hill Cemetery at night, telling stories about the ghost of Hannah Whitmore. Parents used the story as a cautionary tale, warning their children never to wander alone in remote areas. The COVID-19 pandemic brought new challenges to Willow Creek, but it also provided an opportunity for reflection. During the lockdowns, many residents found themselves thinking about the past, about the mysteries that had shaped their community. The Whitmore family had aged considerably, with David developing health problems related to his years of heavy drinking and Elaine becoming increasingly reclusive. Dr. Chun continued to work with the Whitmores, now focusing more on helping them find peace with their loss rather than maintaining hope for Hannah's return. She had seen how prolonged grief could destroy families and was determined to help them heal, even if they never learned the truth about their daughter's fate. "Acceptance doesn't mean giving up," Dr. Chun explained to Elaine during one of their sessions. "It means learning to live with uncertainty while still honoring Hannah's memory. She would want you to find happiness again." The town of Willow Creek had changed significantly since 2004. New businesses had opened, young families had moved in, and the local economy had diversified beyond agriculture. But Rose Hill Cemetery remained largely unchanged, a constant reminder of the community's long history and the mysteries it contained. In early 2024, the town council decided to renovate Rose Hill Cemetery. The old sections had become overgrown, some headstones were damaged by weather and time, and the overall appearance had deteriorated. The project was funded through a combination of town funds and donations from local families who had loved ones buried there. The renovation project was overseen by Jake Morrison, now the head groundskeeper, and a team of volunteer workers from the community. They began by clearing overgrown vegetation, repairing damaged headstones, and improving the cemetery's drainage system. The work was slow and respectful, with care taken to preserve the historical integrity of the site. Among the volunteer workers was Elena Santos, a newcomer to Willow Creek, who had moved to town in 2023 with her husband and 2 young children. Elena was an artist who specialized in stone carving and monument restoration. She had volunteered for the cemetery project because she was passionate about preserving historical sites and wanted to contribute to her new community. Elena had heard the story of Hannah Whitmore's disappearance from her neighbors, but she approached the renovation project with fresh eyes, unburdened by the emotional weight that longtime residents carried. She was methodical in her work, documenting each headstone and carefully cleaning years of accumulated dirt and vegetation. It was Elena who discovered the hidden headstone in the cemetery's northwestern corner. She had been working to clear particularly overgrown section when she noticed something unusual beneath the thick layer of ivy and brush. At first, she thought it was just another old headstone that had been forgotten over the years. But as Elena carefully cleared away the vegetation, she realized that this headstone was different. The carving was precise and modern, clearly not from the same era as the surrounding monuments. The stone itself was made of polished granite, a material that hadn't been commonly used in the cemetery until recent decades. When Elena read the inscription, her blood ran cold. Hannah Grace Whitmore, 1995 to 2004, loved, missed, never found. She recognized the name immediately from the stories. She had heard about the town's most famous missing person case. Elena immediately called Jake Morrison, who arrived at the scene within minutes. Jake had been working at the cemetery for less than a decade, but he knew every headstone, every burial plot, and every piece of the cemetery's official records. This headstone wasn't supposed to exist. This isn't in any of our records, Jake told Elena as they both stared at the mysterious monument. No one has been buried in this section for over 20 years, and certainly not Hannah Whitmore. Her body was never found. Jake contacted Chief Rivera immediately, and within an hour, the cemetery was swarming with police officers, forensic technicians, and FBI agents. The discovery of the unauthorized headstone had instantly reopened one of the most puzzling missing person cases in the region's history. Agent Walsh, now in her 50s and nearing retirement, returned to Willow Creek to oversee the investigation. She had never forgotten Hannah's case, and the appearance of the mysterious headstone represented the first significant development in 20 years. "This changes everything," Agent Walsh told Chief Rivera as they examined the headstone. "Someone with knowledge of Hannah's disappearance placed this here. It's either a confession, a memorial, or a message. We need to find out who did this and why." The forensic analysis began immediately. The headstone was removed from the cemetery and taken to a specialized laboratory for examination. Experts analyzed the stone's composition, the carving techniques used, and any trace evidence that might reveal its origin. The results were frustrating. The granite had been quarried from a common source used by monument companies throughout the region. The carving had been done with professional equipment, but the technique was standard and could have been performed by dozens of skilled craftsmen in the area. More disturbing was the discovery of recent excavation around the headstone's location. Soil analysis revealed that the area had been disturbed within the past month, suggesting that the headstone had been placed very recently. This meant that whoever was responsible for the memorial had been carrying their secret for 20 years. Before deciding to create this monument, the news of the headstone's discovery spread quickly through Willow Creek and beyond. Media outlets that had covered Hannah's original disappearance returned to the town, and the case once again became national news. The Whitmore family was thrust back into the spotlight, forced to relive their trauma while hoping for answers. Elaine Whitmore's reaction to seeing photographs of the headstone was profound and heartbreaking. She collapsed when Chief Rivera showed her the images and had to be hospitalized for emotional shock. David, now in his 70s and suffering from early-stage dementia, seemed confused by the development, sometimes forgetting that Hannah had Been missing for 20 years. She's still here, Elaine whispered to Dr. Chun from her hospital bed. Whoever placed that stone, they know where she is. They know what happened to my little girl. The investigation into the headstone's origin became the most intensive police effort in Willow Creek's history. Every monument company within a 200-mile radius was contacted and asked to review their records for any orders matching the headstone specifications. Stone carvers, both professional and amateur, were interviewed about their recent work. Breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Rodriguez, who worked as a secretary at Eternal Memories Monument Company in the nearby city of Millbrook, recognized the headstone's description when she saw it on the news. She remembered processing an unusual order about 6 weeks earlier. A man came in with very specific requirements, Maria told Agent Walsh during their interview. He had the inscription already written out, and he paid in cash. He said it was for a private memorial service, and that he would pick up the stone himself. Maria's description of the customer was vague, a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. He had spoken softly and seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact and keeping the conversation brief. He had given the name, John Smith, and provided no contact information, the security footage from Eternal. Memories had been automatically deleted after 30 days, so there was no visual record of the mysterious customer. But Maria's testimony confirmed that someone had deliberately commissioned Hannah's memorial stone and had taken great care to remain anonymous. The investigation expanded to include surveillance footage from businesses near the cemetery, hoping to catch the person who had placed the headstone. Unfortunately, Rose Hill Cemetery had no security cameras, and the surrounding area was largely rural, with few businesses that might have captured relevant footage. Chief Rivera organized a canvass of the entire town, asking residents if they had seen anyone acting suspiciously near the cemetery in recent weeks. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of people calling in tips and theories. Most of the information proved irrelevant, but the community's engagement demonstrated how deeply Hannah's disappearance had affected the town. Dr. Chun was brought in to analyze the psychological profile of someone who would create an unauthorized memorial after 20 years of silence. She theorized that the person responsible was likely someone who had been carrying guilt about Hannah's disappearance and had finally reached a breaking point. This act suggests someone who knew Hannah personally and has been struggling with their knowledge of what happened to her, Dr. Chun explained to the investigators. The memorial is both a confession and a plea for forgiveness. They want the truth to come out, but they're afraid of the consequences. Father O'Brien, now in his 80s and struggling with his own health issues, was questioned extensively about anyone who might have confessed to him about Hannah's disappearance. He maintained his vow of confidentiality regarding confessions, but he did share his general observations about the town's residents over the years. There have been people who carried heavy burdens, Father O'Brien told Agent Walsh. People who seemed tormented by secrets they couldn't share. But I cannot violate the sanctity of confession, even in a case like this. The search for answers led investigators to re-examine everyone who had been involved in the original investigation. They tracked down former residents who had moved away from Willow Creek, interviewed retired police officers who had worked on the case, and reviewed every piece of evidence from the original investigation. One name that kept appearing in the renewed investigation was Marcus Thompson, a former construction worker who had been in town during the week of Hannah's disappearance. Thompson had been questioned briefly in 2004, but had been cleared when his alibi checked out. Now investigators learned that Thompson had died in a car accident in 2019, taking any secrets he might have had to his grave. Another person of interest was William Carver, a local man who had exhibited strange behavior in the months following Hannah's disappearance. Carver had been known to wander through the cemetery at night, and several residents had reported seeing him acting erratically. He had been institutionalized for mental health issues in 2006 and had remained in various facilities since then. When investigators interviewed Carver at his current residence, a supervised care facility in the state capital, they found him to be coherent but evasive. He denied any knowledge of Hannah's disappearance or the mysterious headstone, but his nervous behavior and contradictory statements made him a person of interest. "I didn't hurt anybody," Carver repeated during his interview. "I just liked to walk in the cemetery at night. It was peaceful there, quiet, but I didn't do anything wrong." The investigation also revisited the theory that Hannah's disappearance was connected to the other missing children cases that Nancy Chun had identified years earlier. FBI analysts created a comprehensive database of similar disappearances. The region, looking for patterns that might point to a serial offender. The pattern analysis revealed disturbing similarities between Hannah's case and 6 other disappearances over the past 50 years. All of the children had been between the ages of 8 and 12. All had disappeared from or near cemeteries, and all had been described as unusually mature or sensitive for their age. Most chilling was the discovery that in 3 of the other cases, mysterious memorials had appeared years after the disappearances. In 1987, a small wooden cross with the name Timothy Ross had been found in the woods behind Rose Hill Cemetery. In 1999, a stone marker bearing the name Sarah Mitchell had been discovered in a cemetery in the neighboring county. The memorials had been dismissed as pranks or family gestures at the time, but now they seemed to be part of a larger pattern. Agent Walsh realized that they might be dealing with someone who had been abducting children for decades, someone who felt compelled to create memorials for their victims. The psychological profile suggested a perpetrator who saw themselves as a caretaker rather than a killer, someone who believed they were protecting the children in some twisted way. "We're looking for someone who has been active for at least 50 years, Agent Walsh explained to her team. "Someone who has a deep connection to cemeteries and burial grounds. They might work in the funeral industry, or they might be someone who has lost a child of their own and is trying to fill that void." The investigation took a dramatic turn when Elena Santos, the artist who had discovered the headstone, came forward with additional information. She had been continuing her work on the cemetery renovation when she noticed something unusual about the soil in the area where the headstone had been placed. "There's something down there," Elena told Chief Rivera. "The soil composition is different, and I found fragments of what looks like children's clothing about 3 feet down. I think there might be a burial site that's not in any official records." The discovery led to a carefully orchestrated excavation of the area around where the headstone had been found. Using ground-penetrating radar and archaeological techniques, investigators began to uncover what appeared to be a hidden burial site. The excavation revealed a horrifying truth. Buried in a small clearing in the cemetery's northwestern corner were the remains of not just 1 child, but 3. The bodies had been carefully arranged and preserved, wrapped in cloth, and placed in a makeshift crypt that had been hidden beneath years of accumulated earth and vegetation. The forensic examination of the remains would take weeks, but preliminary analysis suggested that one of the bodies was consistent with Hannah Whitmore's age and physical characteristics at the time of her disappearance. The other 2 bodies appeared to be children of similar ages, possibly victims from earlier disappearances. The discovery of the hidden burial site transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a serial murder investigation. The FBI brought in additional resources, including forensic anthropologists and child psychologists, to help process the evidence and understand the perpetrator's methodology. Dr. Chun was called in to help analyze the psychological aspects of the crime scene. The careful arrangement of the bodies and the creation of the memorial headstone suggested someone who is deeply troubled but also methodical in their actions. This person saw themselves as a protector, Dr. Chun explained to the investigators. They believed they were saving these children from something, possibly from the pain of growing up or from some perceived threat. The memorial headstone represents their need to be remembered and possibly to be forgiven. The news of the discovered remains devastated the Whitmore family and the entire town of Willow Creek. After 20 years of uncertainty, the confirmation that Hannah was dead brought a different kind of grief, the finality of loss mixed with the horror of how she had died. Elaine Whitmore, now a woman in her 70s, struggled to process the news. The fantasy that Hannah might still be alive somewhere, that she might come home someday, had sustained her through 2 decades of grief. Now, faced with the reality of her daughter's death, she had to rebuild her understanding of what had happened and find a way to say goodbye. "At least we know," Elaine whispered to Dr. Chun during one of their sessions. "At least we can lay her to rest properly. But the thought of what she must have gone through, it's unbearable." The investigation into who had killed Hannah and the other children intensified as forensic evidence was processed. DNA analysis of the remains confirmed that one of the bodies was indeed Hannah Whitmore, providing closure for her family, but raising new questions about the identity of the other. Victims. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Margaret Caldwell's historical research, which had been donated to the town library, contained a detailed genealogical chart of families who had lived in Willow Creek over the past century. Cross-referencing this information with the investigation's findings, researchers discovered a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. All of the missing children, including Hannah, were descendants of families who had been among the original settlers of Willow Creek. More specifically, they were all related to families who had been involved in the controversial decision to build Rose Hill Cemetery on what had been Native American burial grounds. The historical connections suggested that the killer might have been motivated by some twisted sense of justice or retribution, targeting children whose ancestors had desecrated sacred ground. This theory was supported by the fact that all of the victims had been found in the cemetery itself, as if they were being returned to the sacred space their ancestors had violated. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Chief Rivera received an anonymous letter in the mail. The letter, written in shaky handwriting, contained a full confession to the murders of Hannah Whitmore and the other children. The writer claimed to be dying and wanted to clear their conscience before it was too late. "I never meant to hurt them," the letter read. "I was protecting them from the darkness that follows our bloodline. The old spirits told me what had to be done. The children are safe now, sleeping peacefully in the sacred ground where they belong." The letter was signed, "A Guardian of the Sacred Ground," and included detailed information about the murders that had never been made public. Forensic analysis of the handwriting and paper suggested that the writer was elderly and possibly suffering from a degenerative condition that affected their motor skills. Investigation focused on elderly residents of Willow Creek who might have had access to the information contained in the letter. The list of suspects was surprisingly short, as most of the town's longtime residents had been eliminated from consideration during the original investigation. One name that emerged as a person of interest was Samuel Hartley, the son of former cemetery groundskeeper Thomas Hartley. Samuel had worked as his father's assistant for many years and would have had intimate knowledge of the cemetery's layout and history. He had also been present during the original investigation in 2004, giving him access to details about the case that weren't public knowledge. When investigators went to interview Samuel Hartley, they discovered that he had been admitted to a hospice facility 2 weeks earlier with terminal cancer. He was in the final stages of his illness and had been heavily sedated for pain management. His doctor estimated that he had only days or weeks to live. Samuel's condition made it impossible to conduct a traditional interrogation, but his nurse reported that he had been increasingly agitated in recent weeks, talking about children and graves, and asking repeatedly about forgiveness. His behavior matched the profile of someone who was carrying a heavy burden and was nearing the end of their life. The investigation team arranged for a bedside interview with Samuel Hartley, hoping to get a confession before he died. Samuel was barely conscious, but when Agent Walsh mentioned Hannah Whitmore's name, his eyes opened and he began to speak in a weak, raspy voice. "I did what had to be done," Samuel whispered. "The spirits told me. They said the children had to return to the sacred ground. I kept them safe. I kept them together." Samuel's confession was recorded, but his deteriorating mental state made it difficult to determine how much of what he said was reliable. He spoke about hearing voices from the old burial ground, about being chosen to correct the wrongs of the past, and about caring for the children he had taken. "Hannah was so peaceful," Samuel said, his voice barely audible. "She didn't fight. She understood. She said she wanted to be with her grandmother. I helped her. I helped all of them." Samuel Hartley died 3 days after his confession, taking many secrets with him to his grave. The investigation continued, but without the perpetrator available for questioning, many details about the murders would never be known. The forensic evidence supported Samuel's confession to some degree. His fingerprints were found on the memorial. Headstone and soil samples from his home matched the earth found at the burial site. However, the psychological aspects of the case remained puzzling. Dr. Chun analyzed Samuel's confession and concluded that he had likely been suffering from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia with religious delusions. His belief that he was hearing voices from Native American spirits, and his conviction that he was protecting the children, suggested a complete break from reality. Samuel created an elaborate fantasy to justify his actions, Dr. Chun explained to the investigators. He couldn't face the reality that he was harming children, so he convinced himself that he was saving them. The memorial headstone was his way of seeking recognition for what he believed was a noble deed. The resolution of Hannah's case brought mixed emotions to the Whitmore family and the town of Willow Creek. After 20 years of uncertainty, there was finally closure, but the truth was more horrific than anyone had imagined. Elaine Whitmore arranged for a proper funeral for Hannah, finally able to lay her daughter to rest in the same cemetery where she had disappeared. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had participated in the original search efforts and those who had never stopped hoping for Hannah's safe return. "Hannah was a light in this world," Father O'Brien said during the funeral service. "Her death was a tragedy, but her memory will continue to inspire us to protect the innocent and to never give up hope, even in the darkest times." The other victims found at the burial site were also identified through DNA analysis and historical records. Timothy Ross, the boy who had disappeared in 1979, was finally returned to his family for burial. The third victim was identified as Maria Santos, a girl who had disappeared from a neighboring town in 1989. The revelation that Samuel Hartley had been killing children for decades shocked the community and raised questions about how he had been able to operate undetected for so long. His position as the cemetery groundskeeper's son had given him access and knowledge that had made his crimes possible. Chief Rivera announced his retirement following the resolution of Hannah's case, stating that he felt he could finally leave the department, knowing that justice had been served. The case had defined his career and had driven him to become a better investigator and a more compassionate person. "Hannah Whitmore changed all of us," Chief Rivera said at his retirement ceremony. "She reminded us that every life is precious, and that we must never stop fighting for the truth, no matter how long it takes." The discovery of Samuel Hartley's crimes led to a comprehensive review of the cemetery's security and management practices. The town council implemented new safety measures, including surveillance cameras and regular security patrols, to ensure that Rose Hill Cemetery would never again be the site of such horrors. Elena Santos, the artist who had discovered the headstone, was deeply affected by her role in solving the case. She had moved to Willow Creek seeking a peaceful life for her family, but instead had uncovered one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the region's history. Despite the trauma, she felt honored to have played a part in bringing justice. To Hannah and the other victims, "I keep thinking about Hannah's mother," Elena told her husband as they watched their own children play in their backyard. How she waited 20 years for answers. How she never gave up hope. "I'm grateful that we could finally give her some peace." The case attracted national attention once again, with documentaries and true crime podcasts exploring the details of Samuel Hartley's crimes and the decades-long investigation. Nancy Chun, the journalist who had covered Hannah's disappearance, wrote a follow-up book about the case's resolution, donating the proceeds to organizations that supported families of missing children. Dr. Chun continued to work with the Whitmore family and other affected community members, helping them process the complex emotions that came with finally knowing the truth. The resolution of the case brought closure, but it also opened new wounds as people struggled to understand how such evil could have existed in their midst for so long. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Chun explained to a support group she organized. For people affected by the case, some days the knowledge that Hannah is at peace will bring comfort. Other days, the reality of what she endured will be overwhelming. Both reactions are normal and valid. The town of Willow Creek established a memorial garden in Hannah's honor, featuring violet flowers and a small fountain where people could sit and reflect. The garden was built on the site where Hannah's house had stood, as her parents had donated the property to the town after David's death from complications related to his alcoholism. Elaine Whitmore, now in her mid-70s, found a new purpose in advocating for missing children and their families. She worked with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to missing person cases and spoke at conferences about the importance of never giving up hope. Hannah's story doesn't end with her death, Elaine told audiences at these events. Her story continues through every child who comes home safely because we've learned from what happened to her. Her legacy is that other families won't have to wait 20 years for answers. The investigation into Samuel Hartley's background revealed a troubled childhood marked by abuse and neglect. His father, Thomas Hartley, had been an alcoholic who had subjected his son to physical and emotional abuse. Samuel had been diagnosed with mental illness as a young adult, but had never received consistent treatment. Mental health professionals who reviewed Samuel's case noted that his crimes might have been prevented if he had received proper psychiatric care and medication. His deteriorating mental state over the decades, combined with his isolation and access to vulnerable victims, had created the perfect conditions for his criminal behavior. Samuel Hartley was both perpetrator and victim, explained Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist who studied the case. His crimes were inexcusable, but they were also the result of untreated mental illness and a system that failed to protect both him and his victims. The case also highlighted issues with cemetery management and oversight. Investigations revealed that Samuel had been working at Rose Hill Cemetery for over 30 years without proper background checks or supervision. His familiarity with the grounds and his perceived trustworthiness as the groundskeeper's son had made him nearly invisible to suspicion. Changes were implemented not just in Willow Creek, but in cemetery management practices across the region. Background checks became mandatory for all cemetery employees, and new protocols were established for monitoring and securing burial grounds, especially those in remote or isolated locations. The memorial headstone that had broken the case open was preserved as evidence, but after the trial proceedings were complete, it was given to the Whitmore family. Elaine chose to have it placed in the memorial garden, where it serves as a reminder of Hannah's life and the importance of never forgetting the victims of violence. Father O'Brien, now in his final years, reflected on the case's impact on his faith and his understanding of good and evil. He had struggled with the theological implications of Samuel's crimes, particularly the man's belief that he was acting on divine instruction. Evil can disguise itself as righteousness, Father O'Brien said during one of his final sermons. Samuel Hartley believed he was doing God's work, but he was driven by madness and delusion. True faith calls us to protect the innocent, not to harm them in the name of some twisted interpretation of divine will. The case had far-reaching effects on the town's children and families. Parents became more protective, and many children developed fears about visiting cemeteries or being alone in public spaces. School counselors worked with students to address these anxieties and to help them process the traumatic knowledge that a killer had been living among them for decades. Jake Morrison, the current cemetery groundskeeper, struggled with the knowledge that his workplace had been the site of such horrible crimes. He considered leaving his position, but ultimately decided to stay, feeling that he could help restore the cemetery's reputation as a peaceful resting place. "I won't let Samuel Hartley's crimes define this place," Jake told the town council during a public meeting. Rose Hill Cemetery has been a source of comfort for grieving families for over a century. "I'm going to make sure it remains a place of peace and healing." The investigation also revealed that Samuel had kept detailed journals documenting his crimes and his deteriorating mental state. These journals, discovered in his home after his death, provided insight into his thought processes and confirmed details of his confession. The journals were too disturbing to be released to the public, but they helped investigators understand his motivations and methods. Agent Walsh retired from the FBI shortly after the case was resolved, citing the emotional toll of investigating crimes against children for over 20 years. She had worked on hundreds of cases, but Hannah's disappearance had affected her more deeply than any other. "Some cases stay with you forever," Agent Walsh said during her retirement ceremony. Hannah Whitmore was one of those cases. "I'm grateful that we were finally able to bring her home and give her family the answers they deserved." The resolution of Hannah's case led to renewed interest in other unsolved missing person cases in the region. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing cold cases to see if there might be connections to Samuel Hartley, or if similar methodologies might help solve other mysteries. 2 additional cases were eventually linked to Samuel through forensic evidence and witness testimony. The families of those victims also received closure, though it came with the same mixture of relief and horror that the Whitmores had experienced. As the years passed, the intensity of media attention faded, but the impact of Hannah's case continued to influence law enforcement practices and community safety measures. Training programs for missing person investigations now included lessons learned from the Whitmore case and the importance of considering all possibilities, no matter how unlikely they might seem. The town of Willow Creek slowly healed from the Yald trauma of learning that a serial killer had lived among them for decades. New families moved in, children grew up, and life returned to its normal rhythm. But the memory of Hannah Whitmore and the other victims remained, serving as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and community protection. Elena Santos continued her work restoring historical monuments, but she never forgot the moment when she discovered the headstone that changed everything. She kept a photograph of Hannah on her desk, a reminder of the young girl whose story had touched her life in such a profound way. "I think about Hannah every day," Elena told her daughter. Years later, she was just a little girl who wanted to visit her grandmother's grave. She deserved to grow up, to have a family, to live a full life. The fact that someone took that away from her is something I'll never understand. The case also highlighted the importance of mental health resources in small communities. Willow Creek established a mental health clinic and implemented programs to identify and assist people who might be struggling with psychiatric issues. The goal was to prevent future tragedies by ensuring that people like Samuel Hartley received the help they needed before their conditions deteriorated to the point of violence. Dr. Chun continued her work with the community, helping people process their grief and trauma while also educating them about the warning signs of mental illness. She established support groups for various populations affected by the case, including families of victims, law enforcement personnel, and community members who had known Samuel Hartley. The memorial garden dedicated to Hannah became a place of pilgrimage for people from across the country who had been touched by her story. Visitors would leave flowers, particularly violets, and small mementos in her memory. The garden served as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, communities could come together to honor the innocent and work toward healing. As Elaine Whitmore entered her 80s, she reflected on the long journey from Hannah's disappearance to the resolution of her case. The pain of losing her daughter had never fully healed, but the knowledge that justice had been served and that other families had found closure through Hannah's case gave her a sense of purpose. Hannah's death wasn't in vain if it prevents other children from suffering the same fate, Elaine said during her final interview with Nancy Chun. She was taken from us, but her story will continue to protect other children for generations to come. The case of Hannah Whitmore became a landmark in missing person investigations, studied in law enforcement academies and criminal justice programs across the country. The importance of preserving evidence, maintaining hope, and considering all possibilities became standard teachings, with Hannah's case serving as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. On the 20th anniversary of Hannah's death, the town of Willow Creek held a memorial service that was attended by hundreds of people, including law enforcement officers, FBI agents, and families of other missing children. The service celebrated Hannah's life, while also acknowledging the progress that had been made in protecting children and solving missing person cases. Father O'Brien, now in his 90s and in declining health, delivered what would be his final public address at the memorial service. His words resonated with the assembled crowd and captured the essence of Hannah's legacy. Hannah Whitmore was a light that was extinguished too soon, Father O'Brien said, his voice trembling with emotion. But her light continues to shine through the love of her family, the dedication of those who never stopped searching for her, and the commitment of all of us to protect the innocent. She may be gone, but she will never be forgotten. The case officially closed with Samuel Hartley's death, but its impact continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Hannah's story became a symbol of the importance of perseverance, the power of community, and the necessity of never giving up hope, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Today, Rose Hill Cemetery stands as a place of peace and reflection, its dark history acknowledged, but not allowed to overshadow its role as a final resting place for generations of families. The memorial garden where Hannah is remembered continues to bloom with violets each spring, a living testament to a young girl whose brief life touched so many people and whose story will never be forgotten. The headstone that started it all, now weathered by time and tears, bears silent witness to the truth that was finally revealed. Hannah Grace Whitmore, 1995 to 2004. Loved, missed, never found. The final words proved prophetic in a way that no one could have anticipated. Hannah had been found, justice had been served, and her memory would live on forever in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. In the end, Hannah Whitmore's story is one of tragedy and triumph, of loss and discovery, of a community that refused to give up and a family that never stopped believing. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope can prevail, truth can emerge, and healing can begin. Hannah's legacy lives on, not just in the memorial garden that bears her name, but in every child who comes home safely because someone remembered her story and refused to give up the search.